welcome to Expert Discussions. My name is Josh Mayse. I'm a financial advisor with Wright-Patt Credit Union and CUSO Financial Services. And today I'm here with Kevin Wilardsen, PhD at Wright State University. And we are going to discuss microeconomics, macroeconomics, and how that affects you. Hi, Kevin. Welcome.
Thank you. How are you doing? Hi, everyone.
How are you doing today?
I've been better, but I've also been worse, so I guess it all works out in the end.
Yeah, that's good. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you study in your field?
My name is Kevin Wilardsen. I am a PhD economist. I did my PhD work at Florida State University in Tallahassee. I have been working at Wright State for going on, I believe, 4 years now. My primary fields of focus are applied microeconomics, and that usually revolves around kind of urban, regional, and public finance and public choice economics. So I tend to focus on the micro aspect of economics and primarily on the applied portion. So local governments, that kind of stuff. So it's really an interesting time right now to be doing research, given that local governments and regional economies are confronting some really severe issues, and it's going to be interesting to see how they work their way through those problems.
So what are some of those severe issues that you see?
Well, right now, so if you're not familiar, most local governments get their revenue via either one of two sources. At least in Ohio, they get it from the income tax. So your local government will tax your income, or you'll get it from property tax. And it's probably going to be the case that the local governments that focus more on their property tax are going to do a little bit better than those that focus on their income, because the relative elasticities are different. So the idea here is that if you're everybody's kind of going through this crisis together, and a lot of people have lost their jobs, which means their income went from something to nothing. And whatever they're getting by way of employment support from the federal government is being taxed. But basically, I think it's generally safe to say that incomes have fallen. And municipalities that have focused more on property taxes are probably going to do a little bit better, just because most people build their property tax into the escrow of their mortgage, which means that if you think about it, if you're financially strapped, the last thing that you stop paying is likely your mortgage, which means that those local governments are probably going to do better with respect to getting those revenues. That's not to say that they're going to be completely shielded. Everybody is going to have to take a haircut here, because that's not the only tax. They rely on sales taxes, income tax, licensing fees, that kind of stuff. And if you think about it just from the perspective of revenue from like traffic tickets, and like, for instance, I'm doing some research on speed cameras and red light cameras in the area. And if people aren't driving and they're not going anywhere, they're getting less. Revenues pretty much across the board are falling. So this kind of leads us in a situation where, well, what can you expect local governments to do? Because in many instances, they face a lot of really high fixed cost constraints, right? You can't get rid of teachers, right? Not immediately, you can't. So they're going to be binding. And what I would expect is that over the next couple of years, you're either going to see them find new revenue sources, which means increasing taxes, shifting to new types of, if you didn't have a property tax, you might find that your local government starts one. Or there's going to be cuts in services. So there's really no way around it. Productivity in general has fallen. So like, if productivity falls, you can't maintain the same level of consumption. Something has to give. So that would be, I would imagine that you'll start to see services getting cut at local and regional levels. That's county, city, state. And everybody is facing a kind of budget crisis.
So most of these local economies and local governments, they can't run a negative deficit like the federal government can. Is that right? So they have to
Yeah.
raise revenue.
So local governments are on what are called basically budget balance, or they have to run a balanced budget. I'm sorry. So effectively, what that means is that unlike the federal government that can, I mean, in a sense, print money, they can issue debt. So local governments can issue debts, but it's kind of the general rule of thumb in local government finance that you do not fund current operations on debt, right? Which means that if you're not bringing in enough money to pay your employees and to meet your services, the very worst thing that you can do is go into debt to then do that. So effectively, what that means is that something has to be cut, and usually what they'll cut is capital services or capital expenditures. So they'll forego building a new building that would perhaps make it easier or more productive in the future. So those are the first things to go because they tend to be politically popular, in that it's easy to cut something that doesn't exist yet, right? So if you're providing a service that people have gotten used to and then you cut that, that's politically unpopular. But if you had planned to do something for people in the future and you cut the thing that doesn't exist, nobody really knows unless they're paying attention. So I would imagine that the growth in government services to slow down considerably given those capital cuts.
And this is probably something we saw before the pandemic, right? This isn't a new phenomenon. This is something that was existing before the pandemic, but the pandemic kind of exacerbated the problem and made it much worse than it was before.
Absolutely. And part of the reason that I'm pretty confident that this is going to be the case, that they'll cut capital expenditures, is because that's effectively what happened in this Florida. So again, when I was in grad school, a lot of my research focused on Florida. That's just because that's where Florida State was located. And what I found is that, so Florida went through this real housing crisis, right? And Florida finances almost all of their cities and incorporated areas with the property tax. And when they went through the housing crisis, it's kind of like the same complete revenue shock. So when all of the value of the houses fall, and the millage rate stays the same, revenues fall. And what they do, they just got capital expenditure. I mean, that's how you balance a budget. So, yeah, I think that cities across the United States are just going to engage in the same behavior here because, again, I think it's politically easier to do that than to make real cuts. And let me emphasize the fact that that's not what you should do, right? You should continue making capital investments because that's how you're more productive in the future. But you should also cut some current expenditures as well. There should, optimally, you would expect a mix, but that's not what's going to happen.
So I think we've seen a lot of municipalities and local governments fining people for local ordinances like not painting your house or not mowing your lawn, or coming up with creative ways to charge people to raise revenue for the city.
Go ahead, finish. I'm sorry.
So I was going to say too, I think we've also seen just locally, I've had clients recently coming into the credit union saying, my property taxes were raised 30% this year because of the red hot property market over the last 2 years, and my valuation is much higher now. My property taxes are much higher.
Yeah, and what we found is that the millage rates don't tend to adjust downward to reincorporate those. They don't adjust downward as fast, right? So if you think of your property tax bill as being a function of the rate that you have to pay and the evaluation on your home, if the evaluation on your home goes up, they could lower the rate and keep the nominal amount the same, right? The amount that you pay. They don't do that. And again, usually what ends up happening is they just keep the rate where it's at, let properties value, and then collect more in tax revenues.
Sure.
And this is going to be like different cities are going to take different strategies, I would expect, just because of the types of cities. So there's a concept floating around in the literature that is large cities like Cincinnati or Columbus, and even Dayton to some degree, are going to have a kind of principal city or monopoly status, in that if you want the culture or the life that a large city provides. If you want, it's kind of interesting to see how coronavirus would affect this, right? Because a lot of the things that a big city would benefit you for living in a big city, you can't do right now. I can't go to a play. I can't go to a Bengals game. So the idea here is because they have these amenities that you can't get in the suburbs around, it's likely the case that we will, like they will get away, they will be able to get away with increasing their millage rate or increasing property tax rates or increasing different types of fees over and above what something like a small suburb of one of these cities was able to do, right? Precisely because people will be willing to accept the higher tax rates in compensation for the fact that they are close to amenities that don't exist in other places. So we've kind of already established that local governments are going to be confronting with different types of revenue shortfalls. And I think that they're going to cut capital expenditure, and that's going to be something that almost all local governments do. But the other aspect, because there are two sides of a budget, you have the revenue and the expenditure, and how they respond to how they increase revenues is going to, in some ways, be municipality or incorporated area specific. So large cities like Cincinnati or Columbus and even Dayton are usually what are considered either principal cities, and there's a concept floating around in the literature that gives these types of cities a monopoly status. And what I mean by that is that given certain types of amenities like football teams or being able to see a Broadway show that comes to town, those can really only be supported in relatively large cities. And these local governments understand that. So what they'll do is they leverage that position or they leverage that information. So if you really like those things, you may be more willing to accept a higher tax rate or higher fees or whatnot to continue living in that city because those are the things that you enjoy. And what I would expect is that local or large municipalities like that are going to focus on those things. There's going to be kind of a pretty much across the board increase in revenue sources for them. And you can kind of contrast this with something like a local suburb that you live in or even a town. Right? They're not going to have access to those types of revenue mechanisms. So they're going to have to either cut their expenditures, which is what I would expect, especially for the smaller towns, right? Because there's a lot more competition. If you like living in a small town, there are hundreds of small towns you can go live in, right? If you like living in a big city, there are not that many of them. So there's a lot more competition in how and where you live with respect to that. So if I were trying to plan on how could I best adjust to these new circumstances, the first thing I would do is figure out, well, what kind of municipality do I live in? What do they have by way of revenue mechanisms? And I might be able to avoid some of these just by changing my behavior a little bit. And like, for instance, if I live in a suburb, it might be worth your time kind of contesting the reevaluation of your home, right? So if they're going to rely primarily on the property tax, fight the evaluation. There's probably not going to be enough people that it matters, and there's a good chance that you win, right? So in some ways, that's going to shield you from those taxes. That's going to be effort on your part, but it's not something that's completely unrealistic, especially if you think that the growth and the value of homes is overstated. Now, again, there's this kind of a double-edged sword because this might come back to bite you if you plan on moving. So always keep that in mind.
So how do local governments get out of this trap? Because it seems like with the pandemic and unemployment and closing of local businesses and this sort of spiral that we've gone into that's accelerated, how do they work out of the situation they got themselves into?
I think this comes in two different phases. One is going to be a combination of pretty much everything that we've talked about now. I would expect increased taxes. And I would also expect decreased services. For instance, there's talk of perhaps ways to cut the cost of education, which is one a major cost. The big costs to a local government are, your police services, fire, education, those types of transportation. And I think that you're going to see extreme cuts to those services, increased taxation, and then they may have to renegotiate a lot of the retirement contracts that they've made with respect to public employees. And the only issue with all of those things is that those cuts are all going to be politically unpopular.
Sure. Do you think that the government will step in at any point?
I was going to say the next step would be that many of them are going to be bailed out by the federal government, especially like the more, I would imagine that this will be more prone to the larger cities, the major municipalities that are in severe trouble. And likely because the federal government I'm not sure that they want to get in the business of bailing out cities directly. It'll probably start with block grants back to the state or to the individual states, and then the state will divvy out that money depending on which cities are in the worst financial trouble. The problem with that, and that kind of gets to the next topic that we had planned on talking about, is federal government debt. So unlike local governments, federal government can run deficits. And at least to some degree, the argument among some people is that federal governments can run deficits perpetually. And I think that's where I would be in disagreement. I think that the current state of federal debt is probably one of the largest systemic risks that we face.
I totally agree with that. I think that the Fed in particular has worked themselves into a tight spot here with, I don't know how they're going to get out of it if they lower rates to make the debt payments sustainable and keep interest on debt low. Like you said, corporate debt and government debt is the highest it's ever been. So if they lower interest rates, they pretty much kill the banking system, and the banking system is their primary mechanism for getting cash into the economy and monetary creation. But if they raise interest rates, they kind of kill the expansion of the economy. And what you're talking about earlier, I think that also really hurts the housing market, which is what these local municipalities are relying on. So I think that they're in a tight spot. I don't know how they get themselves out of it at the moment.
I would agree with much of that, what you just said. And I mean, I guess, but if you want to dig into it, let's, I want to emphasize that I'm borrowing a lot of work that's already been done by an economist and political scientist, Anthony Davies and James Harrington. But I want to put this kind of federal debt into perspective. And I want to preface a lot of this with saying that I am principally an applied microeconomist. And what we're doing is we're kind of moving outside of that into a type of macro and monetary theorizing, which I have to admittedly say is not my specialty. But at the same time, I think this problem is so large that you don't need to be an expert on the subject to see that there's a problem here.
Sure.
And so what I'll do is I'm going to kind of piggyback on a lot of that work and just give you perspective, or at least give the people that you work with a little bit of perspective. And to do that, just kind of think that as of now, this is all of these numbers that I'm going to tell you all come prior to COVID, right? So when this work was done, like COVID wasn't a thing. So you have to keep in mind that in the last over the last year, we basically added another third to national debt. So,
the Fed balance sheet went from what, 4 trillion to 7 trillion?
Exactly.
So,
I mean, in October of 2020, we had roughly $27 trillion in national debt. And that number is so large that if you think about it in terms of, imagine that you have a football field. And imagine that each blade of grass is $1. You would need almost 100,000 football fields to add up to the amount of debt that we're sitting on right now. And this is just a rough guess, but I mean, that's a lot.
That is a lot.
So the idea here is that if you think about it from looking at the CBO's own kind of numbers, they're projecting that by the end of 2030, we're going to be roughly $38 trillion in debt. Now, if that seems low to you, that's because it probably is. And the reason for that is that the CBO is under a mandate that they don't, that when they project forward or when they make a projection, they have to assume that nobody changes their behavior. So if I make a policy change and then the CBO, the Congress tells the CBO, you know, what's going to happen if we implement this policy, the CBO by law has to assume that nobody's going to change their behavior due to that policy. And if that seems ridiculous, it kind of is, but at the same time, there's a justification for that because you don't want some policy wonk with an axe to grind embedding a bunch of assumptions into their projections, which would be easy enough. So let's kind of move from our conversation forward and take those things into consideration. Well, what this means is that historically the CBO, when they kind of project forward revenues, are usually about 25% too high. So they end up projecting revenues larger than they otherwise end up being, because we can go back and look at their projections and compare them to what actually happened. And then they do the exact opposite thing with respect to costs. Their costs are on average about 10% too low. So if you take the historical bias that has built into the CBO projections and you apply them to those projections now, the federal government is not going to be a $38 trillion in debt by 2030. It's going to be closer to about $90 trillion in debt by 2030. These kind of estimates are coming post-COVID. So this COVID is already built into what I just told you. So there's really kind of three problems with that level of debt. It basically means that there's no incentive on the path of politicians to cut spending. They get to make a big do. So if you recall, there was about $300 million that was a big political fight during the Obama administration, and $300 million is just a drop in the bucket. It's difficult because $1 trillion is so large that it doesn't, like, you don't understand how small 300 trillion is relative to that. The federal government spends about 300 trillion in a couple of days, a couple of weeks.
You mean billion?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, 300 million. That's what I'm saying. You get them confused, but so if that's the case, like I think both parties have basically discovered that there is no political gain to bringing up debt. If you look at the last election cycle, the federal debt wasn't even mentioned. It didn't come up in any of the debates, which means that there's no reason to think that until it becomes politically profitable to talk about it, they're just going to leave it alone. The downside to that is that it's probably going to make the problem worse. The other issue is that to keep everything moving, then you have to keep interest rates low, which means the Federal Reserve is going to have to continue to push down interest rates. Probably the bad part about that is that the primary beneficiary of low interest rates is the federal government, because they get to then borrow and spend at low interest. And the other issue that we need to take into consideration is that we're slowly reaching a point of no return. And I don't want to say slowly, we're actually approaching that point pretty rapidly. If you think about it, we're approaching a point in which it's soon going to be mathematically impossible to pay off that debt given the rate of growth in the economy. To kind of give you perspective, think about it if there was just a 1% increase in the cost of servicing that debt, that's roughly about $280 billion a year. Right? That's the annual cost of Afghanistan. Just to service the debt. That's not paying down any principal at all. So it's certainly becoming a very large problem that if the federal government doesn't get on top of, and the reason that I bring this up is that coronavirus is absolutely making this worse. We went from running $1 trillion deficits to running, I believe, a $3 trillion deficit this year, perhaps $4. We're not really sure because we're not really sure how much money the federal government has spent in 2020. So if you combine that with the political infeasibility of reducing that debt, I don't see a way out of it. Basically what I'm getting there is that there's only two solutions. You need to either increase revenue, which is politically unpopular because that means raising taxes. And what I think is going to happen is they're just going to monetize it. They're going to print money effectively. And the end result of that is going to be some level of inflation.
So we've kind of seen that play out a little bit, but I don't see also how they create inflation. So we've seen that the M1 and the M2, which is the general supply of money in the economy, go through the roof. Those levels are insanely high. But the velocity of money is through the floor at the same time. So the speed at which that money is moving through the economy is very, very slow. And I think partially because the Fed is creating this and putting these reserves on the bank's balance sheets and saying banks go lend the money to create money into the economy. The banks are saying, no, thank you. We've got a pandemic. They're raising minimum standards for mortgages, increasing down payment requirements. There's a moratorium on evictions. So the economy outlook just doesn't look great. So the banks are saying, no, thank you. We don't want to lend money. So they're putting money into the markets and financial assets instead of lending it, which is what creates that velocity of money and creates inflation, unless I'm totally wrong.
Well, so I think the best way to think about it is, so if I'm to understand the case that you're making, is that the reason we haven't seen inflation is that the velocity of money has fallen.
It has, yes, and the banks are unwilling to lend money, which is what creates money into the system that helps drive inflation.
Yeah, no, there's certainly been, especially since 2008, there's been a radical increase in the amount of money that banks have been sitting on. There are other reasons to explain why we haven't quite seen inflation to the degree that you would expect. One of the explanations is the mechanism that you just described, that banks are just simply sitting on the money. So they create money, but it's not getting into the system, right? So you need that money multiplier mechanism to work, which is just the inverse of the reserve ratio. The other thing that I would like to point out is that there is downward pressure, at least with respect to the coronavirus. People almost across the board, they're reducing their consumption. In fact, I want to say I read recently that there may be even a slight uptick in savings rates.
I didn't see that. They're paying off credit cards and increasing savings, which
I mean, if you think about it from a psychological standpoint, that's exactly what you would expect people to do.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The other thing that I would point out is that there's a lot of downward pressure. So if you think about it in terms of prices, you can get reduction in prices a few different ways. You can reduce the money supply, and you can just pull money out. So if you and I are in an economy and there's $100 between us and we use that $100 to trade for goods and services, if I pull out 50, the result is going to be that we have less money, so the prices fall, right?
Sure.
The other way to do that, the other way you can get fall in prices is increased productivity. So if, for instance, if we woke up tomorrow morning and the two of us were both twice as productive as we were yesterday, the end result would be falling prices. And part of the reason that I think we're seeing, or at least there's downward pressure on prices now, is that we have become, at least in the last probably decade and a half, incredibly productive in energy and tech. Tech is getting cheaper in real terms. It's getting better. The quality is getting better. We've become more productive because of our access to tech. I mean, if the conversation that we're having right now and the value that we're providing, I'm not sure could have existed to this degree 10 years ago. And then the other sector that's seen falling prices is energy. And to the degree that firms and other industries use energy, that's also pushing down. So some of the explanations for why we haven't seen inflation, those are probably two of the best arguments that I've heard, is that there's banks sitting on money and that there are falling prices due to increased productivity. It's just a matter of, is that enough? The other thing I would want to point out is that we're also sitting on a kind of unfunded liabilities or unfunded obligations bubble. So the numbers that we think about when you hear the national debt, those are a little misleading because that's the amount of debt that we have already accumulated. If you add in the amount of debt that we could potentially face given the promises that we made to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and those things, the debt is considerably larger. We're not talking about 27 to 30 trillion now. We're talking, and these estimates range wildly. I've seen them as low as 50 in unfunded, and I've seen them as high as 200 trillion. And basically what that means is that there's no way that we could even service that debt if we wanted to. If we were to, again, kind of assume a reasonable 2.5% interest rate on an $80 trillion worth of debt, that's kind of taking the low number. That's roughly 2.5 trillion in interest payments alone.
Is that feasible? Is that even? I don't think that's even possible.
I think total federal government revenues right now are 4 trillion, maybe 3.5 trillion. I mean, basically what that would mean is that by the end of 2050, 2030, somewhere in there, almost half of all federal revenues would go to just servicing the interest on the debt. It's not like, it's getting to the point to where, I mean, economic growth is growing, and it's growing quite rapidly. It's just that government debt is growing that much faster.
Sure.
So what I would expect from that is there are two options. These things are going to happen. But I'm not going to make the mistake of telling you when, because I think I'm pretty confident it will happen in my lifetime. And I'm not going to age myself, but I'm not 40 quite yet. So I would imagine that these things will happen. The first thing that's going to happen is we're going to partially default on our unfunded obligation. It's important to recognize for you when you're setting up your retirement account or making plans for the future, the government is under no legal obligation to give you Social Security. They do not have to pay you that. It's called an obligation, which is why those things are not added into debt, right? Because they actually don't have to give you Social Security. And I would expect to see something along the lines of, if you have a 401k or you have your own private security, they're going to come after that first. So we're going to start, they have no choice other than to raise the age, means test Social Security, and make other adjustments. If you have your own private, investment, you have your own private, they're just, if you make over a certain amount of money, they're just not going to give you Social Security. And that would be where it starts. And that's also going to be the most politically feasible response to the problem. The other thing is that they're going to have to inflate the currency. That's going to be the two. And to kind of put this in perspective right now. So when the government creates debt, let's broadly speaking, in very simplistic terms, you can think of that portion of the debt that they create that's held by the Fed, the Federal Reserve, and the amount of the debt that the Federal Reserve holds usually gets turned into inflation, right? Whereas the other amount, the other point, or the other chunk of the debt that holds doesn't necessarily, because these are either held by private individuals or foreign nations, that doesn't typically result in inflation, or it doesn't necessarily do so. So as of right now, the federal, or the Fed is holding roughly 15% in reserves. So 15% of the total government debt is held at the Fed. And if you were to think about, well, let's take that 90 trillion that we talked about earlier, and if you assume that that ratio stays constant, that all of the new debt that gets created, 15% of that is going to go to the Fed, and the debt does indeed hit 90 trillion over the next 20 to 30 years, that's going to imply anywhere from a 10 to a 15% inflation rate starting roughly at the end of this decade. So by 2030-ish. And again, these are really kind of coarse, very back of the envelope letters. And the assumption here is that we're committing the same kind of fallacy that was committed. We're not assuming that people are going to change their behavior. And I think as we gradually get closer to the realization of this problem, the government's not going to have a choice. They'll have to respond somehow. And it basically gets to the point to where the most profitable decisions are not how well do you predict the market, it's how well do you predict what the government's going to do.
And we're already seeing that, though, right? Most valuations on stocks in the market are kind of out the window. It's mostly just on flows.
I agree with that. I also think that kind of going back to the inflation conversation that we had earlier, I think, yes, so why aren't we seeing inflation? The government just went $3 trillion further in debt. Where is the inflation? And this is, I have to admit, this is the common retort to this argument that I'm presenting here. And to be completely upfront, there aren't very good answers to it, at least in the typical framework that I'm using. So the typical answers would be, well, we have falling prices because of energy and tech, and there's considerable inflation in the stock market. Just go look at any S&P, the Dow Jones, the NASDAQ, and look at them over the last 4 years, and you're seeing exponential growth in the indices. Those aren't reflective of, we haven't been growing exponentially year over year in terms of productivity. So that means that's where I would point my finger. Yes, there's considerable, like a lot of those indices have to be overvalued because that's where that new money is going. Which
right,
is
so we're getting asset inflation, but not real inflation because the money's not working through the system, really.
Yeah, I mean, if when you calculate real inflation, you withhold asset prices, yeah. Because I think that whenever you're looking for inflation, the dead giveaway is to go look where there's exponential growth in prices. And we saw that in 2008 in housing in certain cities like San Francisco or in Miami. If you wanted to find where there's a bubble, look for exponential growth. Now, here's the problem, is that is not a biconditional statement. So you can get exponential growth. That doesn't mean it's a bubble. But all bubbles exhibit exponential growth. You understand what I'm saying?
Sure.
So it's entirely possible. And I have to keep in mind that, again, there are prominent economists with Nobel Prizes that think what I'm saying is wrong. This is kind of my opinion. This is my reading of the situation. To be fair, I mean, I would point to somebody like a Paul Krugman over at the New York Times that would basically argue that I know that he's concerned about the debt, but he's nowhere near as concerned about it as, say, I am right now. I think he would find that the fall in aggregate demand from people not spending money is a far more pressing issue. And to avoid a spiraling downward of economic outcome or economic production, that the government has no choice but to go into debt. And he would argue that we'll just deal with the debt crisis later. I think that is a little misguided, kind of for the reasons that we've spoke of. But I mean, just for the sake of transparency, there are people that absolutely would disagree with what I'm telling you right now.
Well, sure. So our debt as a percentage of GDP is way lower than Europe or Japan. Like, here's
well, that depends on how you measure. So there are a couple of different ways that you can measure government debt. You can do it by way of debt to GDP, and to some degree that's true because we have, we are an incredibly productive nation, and debt to GDP, we're not as bad, but we're certainly not good either, right? I think debt to GDP ratio we're number 7 in the world right now. And that puts us behind Japan and Greece and Portugal, Italy, Ireland, and Belgium. The other thing that I would point out, though, is that in terms of relative magnitudes, we are in a whole other league. These are relatively small nations compared to the total output. So yes, the debt to GDP ratio puts us in that top 7, but that debt, our denominator, or our numerators are lots bigger. And there could be a convexity effect there that we're ignoring. But that's also not the only way to measure government debt. Another popular measure is debt to total revenue in that ratio. And that puts us roughly close to 4, if I recall. So that is, how much debt do you have versus how much money are you bringing in annually in terms of tax revenue. But at the same time, the one, and you do bring up a valid point, the counterexample is Japan. And Japan has consistently ran in the debt to GDP ratios of well over 200%. And they've done that for almost a decade, I believe. And the counter argument to the kind of the framework I'm presenting here would be that Japan has done it. The United States can do it. We're nowhere near 200%. I think we're a little bit over 100%, maybe 115, 118. This 2020 is going to be a blip, right? So it's going to look really bad for this year, and then it should come back down. So it's not entirely like there's no reason, at least they would argue, there's no reason to think that the economy is going to crash completely just because debt to GDP ratios have gotten high. And here is my counterexample. And that, I mean, I have to admit that's a great, like if you're trying to disprove a comment or a statement or a theory, if you find one counterexample, that's all you really need. And so the argument then is you have to then accept the fact that because of this, there must be some other factor at work. And I think the factor at work there is the faith that investors put in Japan and the United States not to let the problem. So this gets into the kind of the MMT type theorizing, such that investors across the world believe that the United States and Japan are not going to let this problem get out of control the way I'm suggesting that it might. And that may actually be a well-founded assumption, which is also why I think what's going to happen is they're going to cut services. They're going to do cuts they're not going to let us become a banana republic. They're not going to let the dollar break. So the way you don't let the dollar break is you cut payments in Social Security. You increase the retirement age. You increase taxes. Paul Volcker in the 1980s or in the 70s and 80s, I'm not exactly sure. I think it was the 80s. He let interest rates get up to 16, 17%.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I was going to say that. So we had like this madman in the Fed that raised interest rates to 18% to kill inflation. Do we see an anti-Volcker now with negative 3% interest rates to boost inflation and let it run wild?
I don't think so, just because it depends on when investors start to get the itch that perhaps the United States. So if you think about it from the prospect of an and many of your many of the people that might watch this are investors. They're holding on to government bonds, and they're planning on getting Social Security. So it's when this group of people starts to get the feeling that maybe, if this bond says I'm owed $100, am I going to get that $100, or am I going to get something that's, I might get $100. It'll be $100 note, but that $100 in real terms isn't going to buy as much as it did 10 years ago. And in fact,
the U.S. currency is depreciated from what I think I saw from 1920 till now. It's depreciated by 99 point something percent.
Oh yeah.
So yeah.
But that's the thing is that's why I say I'm really confident that you can expect to see cuts to Social Security and higher interest rates and taxes. I think that it's just a matter of trying to figure out when, because we can't, at least with the current trajectory we're on, is unsustainable. We cannot continue to do this into perpetuity. And I think even kind of the modern day proponents of like this new school of thought even admit that, they can, like, governments can't go broke. Right? And from that perspective, they're right? Because they can always print money. Whether or not people accept those dollars in payment for goods and services is a different story. So even they would admit that there is the limiting factor here is inflation. But they would also suggest that until we start seeing that inflation, there's really nothing to worry about, which gets back to the conversation that we had earlier. I'm more convinced that we're going to see inflation than they are. But again, in effort of transparency, I was more convinced that we were going to see inflation from 2008 to 2010 than we did. And I'm effectively using the same framework. So
that's their main way of getting out of this, right? Is inflation. I don't think they see GDP growth increasing to the point where it saves us. So inflation and inflating our way out of this is their main option at the moment.
Yeah, and I mean they're going to have to make bigger cuts. And the easiest cuts to make are going to be in the terms of the unfunded obligations. The biggest of which is Medicare and Social Security. And it would be one way that this could also be done. And it's potentially, so there's good theoretical reasons to think that you might be able to cut costs if you had kind of like a single payer healthcare system. This gets into an old paper by Stiglitz that there's an adverse selection problem. And there's considerable debate on whether or not that the healthcare market works the way that paper suggests that it does, because that paper also predicts that the healthcare market should fall apart. And I mean, if we look around, it's not. So, I mean, there's something wrong, but at least the intuition behind it is that if you can get rich, if you think about it, healthcare is insurance. So the best way to lower prices is to get everybody on the same, to spread the risk out through as many people as you can. Which is why something like the Obamacare had a mandate that everybody had to buy insurance, right? That's how you reduce the cost for sick old people, is you spread that cost toward young healthy people. So the idea is, well, what if we're all on the same plan? There's speculation that you could get lower costs that way. And it would work, although I would be concerned about kind of the secondary unintended consequences of that. So the reason that I bring this up is that might be one method that they use to go about, say, reducing their Medicare costs, would be to throw everybody onto the same healthcare plan. But again, I think there's going to be a considerable political opposition to that.
What about central bank digital currency? What do you think about that? So we all have an account at the Fed, and they can specifically target. So let's say you're between 65 and 75, you've got $250,000 in the bank or so. They pay you 0 or -1% interest, so you'll go out and spend, and maybe someone in their 20s, they give them 3% interest so they can save and get towards their retirement. What do you think about central bank digital currency and that whole idea?
So this actually is kind of new to me. I'd have to sit down and think about it for a minute. But the general idea is that, so you would try to get old people to spend and young people to save.
I think the main idea is they can target more directly and effectively who they want to stimulate and who they want to penalize for holding money and not spending.
Like from a feasibility standpoint, again, I would have to sit down and think about it. I'm not sure that's, I mean, I guess, would that even be constitutional?
I don't know.
So that's kind of a great question. I'm trying to understand the benefit to doing that, because
basically, I mean, it's the banking system, so you can't hoard money in assets. You can directly stimulate the economy. So, like, instead of doing $600 or $1,200 checks through fiscal policy, you just use monetary policy to directly influence.
Okay, the end result of that is that people are just going to run to assets.
Probably.
That would be my thing. Like, I'm just thinking about what I would do when confronted with that. Is that, no, I'm not going to hold your digital currency. I'll just go buy something.
Well, I think that's the idea too, is to stimulate inflation with that.
Well, yeah, the issue, okay, and that could potentially work. The issue with that is that it's going to be kind of a misallocation of where that money gets spent. Because if I'm afraid that you're going to, I may run toward property instead of something you want me to buy, right? So if you're trying to stimulate me to go out and spend money, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to spend it on the production of the things that you want. I think the end result would mean that older people just become property holders, which is perhaps one way that I would think about kind of shielding yourself. I mean, from if there is indeed inflation coming, one of the best things that you could do would be to own property, just because like they're not making any more of it. The downside to that is that that's money. Like, if everybody starts to do that, it's going to drive up property prices. And so I would, at least me personally, again, like with respect to, you're going to have to make your own financial decisions, but I would make sure that I was on a fixed rate.
A fixed rate mortgage?
Yeah, a fixed rate anything. You couldn't give me a variable interest rate loan right now.
Do you think rates are going to go up?
I don't see any other way around it. I mean, but it's entirely possible that there is, again, when you start thinking about economics, that one of the issues is that with one little itty bitty conditional that you're missing, you can get the opposite outcome. Right? So it's entirely possible that there's either something that I'm missing or there's something that everything's missing. And so I guess to kind of steelman the opposition to what I'm saying, a lot of people who make their money predicting the future are making the opposite bet I am. Right? So when you look at the markets, interest rates are low. When you look at how people are making their plans for the future, they're not behaving as though they're expecting this type of large inflation rate in the future. They're behaving as though they are expecting business as usual, right? So that should be the kind of the first indication that perhaps I'm missing something, and that's entirely possible. I mean, there's nobody's perfect, and if every fortune teller, if we've learned anything from every fortune teller, is that fortune tellers are always wrong.
Sure.
So.
I think it depends on who you believe, too. If you listen to the Fed and their forward guidance, they're telling you inflation's going up. But if you look around you and you see businesses closing left and right, you say, how can that be? So,
Well, I think both are actually true. I mean, we're seeing inflation. So there's definitely inflation. If you go to the grocery store, prices are going up.
sure.
And the key here is that they're not going up by because we've always seen inflation 3-4% each year. We're not seeing inflation to the rate that we would expect to see inflation. And that's the point that I'm making, is that at least through the framework with which I'm analyzing the current state of the economy, there should be way more inflation. And there should be a lot more inflation in consumers' goods. Now, again, the way I work my way around that, the way I square that circle, is I say that, there are factors pushing down inflation rates and that there is inflation just in asset prices. And you can see that in the exponential growth, but it could be the case that people are just investing more. So it's difficult to predict the future. I would say it's impossible.
Yeah. Do you think some of those prices increases that we're seeing, well, especially with lumber, let's use lumber. So before the pandemic even started, we had slapped tariffs on Canada because we didn't want them importing their lumber. And then the pandemic hit shortly after that, and supply chains shut down or decreased majorly. Now lumber is through the roof, so it costs way more to build a house. So are we seeing something similar in other areas of the economy, which is making prices temporarily increase?
Yeah, I mean that's a good example of, so if that's the case, I would explain the prices in lumber as being the product of a few different things. One, the tariffs that you place on Canada would be a good example, and then at the same time, the demand for lumber, believe it or not, has shifted out. I don't know if you own a home. During the depth of the pandemic, from the nice months from March, April to June, July, August, Home Depots across at least my neighborhood were routinely out of stuff. Now, part of that has to do with the fact that it was difficult to get a supply, but the other part of it is demand side, in that and the reason I was there is I wanted to build a deck. So I can imagine that there's also been a simultaneous fall in supply, but an increase in demand, which is driving up prices. Both of those mechanisms would result, if they were independent of one another, would result in higher prices.
Three things together, that's like the trifecta of high prices.
Yeah, in that sense. And it's difficult to, so the issue here is it's going to be virtually impossible to pull all of those effects apart. So what we observe is higher prices. What caused them is, and to what degree, how much of this do we get to blame on the tariff? How much of this do we get to blame on the shift in demand? How much of this do we get to blame on these other things? It may be impossible to ever untangle that Gordian knot.
Yeah, this could take years to settle itself and work its way out right through the system, and we finally see how the chips fall and where we end up.
Yeah.
So there's really no way of knowing, I guess.
No, and basically what I would do is, and I guess what I am doing is you hope for the best, and don't get me wrong, I certainly hope that I'm wrong. I just don't think that I am. I think that I can pretty much expect to get only a portion of my Social Security back. And it would be wise, at the very least, even if I am wrong, I mean, think of it as from the Pascal's wager. Act as though you do a maxi-min, right? Even if you're wrong, you're still not that bad.
You're not discriminated.
If that makes sense.
Not on the street if you're wrong.
Exactly. So I certainly hope that they can figure out a way to get on top of the debt crisis, or maybe it is entirely possible, and we have to accept this, even as academics, right? Even though I've spent all this time doing the reading that I did, it is possible, and this type of shift has happened in disciplines in the past, that it may be the case that I have to sit down and relearn everything, just because what it turns out that I think I knew, there are nuggets of truth in everything, right? Disciplines wouldn't evolve this far if they didn't. But I may have to reconsider how, the prism through which I view the world.
Well, sure, our own biases probably hold us back the most.
Exactly.
Seeing what's going on.
Never fool yourself, and you're the easiest one to fool.
Yeah, what did George Bush say? Fool me once, can't fool me again.
Yeah, not gonna fool us twice. So yeah, I think that either way, it's difficult to with all of these moving parts. No one knows for sure what's going to happen. Sure. And I used strong language earlier, but let me reiterate, like, no one really knows what's going to happen. And there could be, the Fed got relatively creative in 2008 and 2009, right? So in fact, it's to the point now where a lot of economists, when we start teaching in principles of macroeconomics, we teach, this is the old Fed. This is how the Fed used to do stuff. And in 2008, the Fed just kind of, a bunch of new tools popped up in their tool bin that they were able to use to kind of navigate through the 2008 crisis. And it's also possible that they could come up with something new that nobody's thought of at this point that might be able to push and pull on certain levers that might navigate this debt issue. We simply don't know.
Right, they can always change the rules and modify the course we're on. That's always a possibility. Wouldn't be the first
time. Yeah, no, and that's possible. I just don't. At some point, the elephant gets so big, I don't know what else there is to do about it.
I guess we'll have to wait and see what's next to see what happens next.
Yeah, and I'm certainly sorry to be such a downer. Like, I don't, I want better news other than we're going through a pandemic and, oh, by the way, we're approaching a potential debt crisis.
Well, this isn't an easy fix. There's really, like you were saying earlier, there's no easy fix, and it's not going to be politically popular, probably. So it might just get kicked down the road, and if they do try to fix it, it's probably not going to be the best news. So
yeah,
I think you're forgiven for your tone, for your frankness.
Yeah. But yeah, no, did you have any other questions for me?
No, I think that's it. I really appreciate you coming today and speaking with me and going over these different topics. Hopefully we can do it again later on in the future and as things develop and do an update.
Absolutely. Well, and certainly as I learn more, because I'm going to, like, if this has piqued my interest, I'm definitely going to stay on top of this subject. And as I get more information, yeah, we could certainly do this again.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate it. Thanks for talking with us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.